This is Euronews Now. Here are your top stories. Russia says at least 40 Ukrainian prisoners were killed in a blast, with each side accusing the other of shelling a prison camp in separatist-held Donetsk. Eurozone inflation hits a new record, but economic growth also proves more robust than expected. Plus, preparing for a winter without Russian gas, German cities impose cold showers and switch off the lights in public buildings, all in a bid to save energy.
And here in the Cube, we'll unpack the fall from grace of a Spanish body positivity campaign.
I'm Helena Humphrey, glad you could join me. Moscow has accused Ukraine of killing dozens of its own soldiers in a missile strike on a prisoner of war camp in the Russian-controlled Donetsk region. But Kyiv denies any involvement in the attack, instead blaming Moscow for the blast. Our reporter Glynis Crook has more.
The Russian army has accused Kyiv of organizing an attack on a jail in the separatist-held Donetsk region. Moscow says the facility was housing Ukrainian soldiers, including Azov fighters, and that 40 prisoners were killed and more than 75 wounded. The Ukrainian army says it never conducted strikes on civilian infrastructures or prisoners of war.
At the moment, a large number of Ukrainian servicemen voluntarily lay down their arms, knowing about the humane attitude towards prisoners of war on the Russian side. This blatant provocation is designed to intimidate Ukrainian servicemen. The circumstances of this provocation are now being investigated.
In other news, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has visited the Black Sea port of Odessa. He's overseeing the first grain export from the country since they signed a joint UN-Turkey brokered deal with Russia.
The first ship is being loaded since the start of the war. This is a Turkish ship. I'm standing with this ship in the background. That means the port has started operation. The main thing for us is the port is working, the people are working.
Meanwhile, heavy bombing has destroyed a public transport stop in Mykolaiv, killing at least 5 people and injuring 7 others. Glynis Crook, Euronews.
Well, Ukraine's new prosecutor general says that he will be opening a war crimes investigation into that blast. And in light of that news, I asked Samuel Romani, an associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, about the challenges that authorities will face in establishing the facts behind the incident.
Well, it's going to definitely be a bit difficult to really get a concrete war crimes trial with suspects being held in separatist areas at this moment in time, in part because the Russians are going to be engaging in parallel counter-programming of what they believe to be Ukrainian war crimes in the area that will be observed by their friendly countries like Syria, Bolivia, and some others. So I think it'll be possible to ascertain the details, but being actually able to punish the suspects concretely might be harder than it looks.
Meanwhile, right now we're also hearing from Britain's Ministry of Defence reporting that the Wagner Group, so a Russian private military firm, is being used in the east of Ukraine. And if that's correct, what does this tell us about the shape of Russian forces and their strategy as well?
Well, it's very interesting to track the role of the Wagner Group over the course of time and how much more pronounced and important its role is now compared to what it's been at any point in this 8-year conflict. Because this conflict began in 2014, not in February of 2022. So originally they were embedded with the Donetsk and Luhansk separatist militias as like a kind of force multiplier. Then they became an assassin squad against Zelensky, and they carried out atrocities, maybe even involved in the Bucha massacre, according to some German reports. Then they became cannon fodder while the Russian forces were resupplying, and now they're on the front lines in Popasna, Severodonetsk, and now in the Donetsk front. And that's just a sign of the fact that Russia's running out of trained soldiers, at least from its border force. 75,000 have been killed or injured, according to American reports. And it's having to rely a lot more on untrained forces that are recruited from the poorest regions of the countries. And I wouldn't be surprised down the line, maybe even some foreign fighters popping up in a more concrete way.
Elsewhere today, we've also seen President Zelensky visiting the Odessa region, visiting ports there. Of course, the hope is that Ukrainian grain and grain that's stuck in that port or those ports will soon be out on global markets. But how soon can we expect that?
Well, I think it's hard to tell exactly how much. I mean, this is a very optimistic sign coming from the Ukrainians today. They said that there were 17 basically containers of grain that were docked in the Black Sea at the time of the invasion. And they've been basically stuck there for a period now of almost 6 months. So now those grain forces, that grain's coming out. Then there is another ship that's being loaded, and the Ukrainians say that some of this could start being exported by the end of this week. First via Chornomorsk, and then probably via Odessa later on. So I think the Ukrainians are optimistic of a quick breakthrough here. Poland obviously was presenting a much darker and more cynical picture, citing Russia's tendency to violate agreements of any kind. And Russia's Odessa port strike over the weekend is a reminder that the Russians could still pull something and make these exports very hard to achieve.
Well, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken says that he has spoken to Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov over the phone about the release of 2 detained American citizens. Blinken said he urged Moscow to free basketball star Brittany Griner and former police officer Paul Whelan, with reports suggesting a possible prisoner swap for convicted Russian arms dealer Viktor Bout. It is the first time that the two politicians have spoken since the start of the war in Ukraine. Will Europe be hit by a recession? That is the question that economists are asking as inflation across the Eurozone hits a record high of 8.9%. Now, according to the EU Statistics Office, Eurostat, the rising cost of energy, food, industrial goods and services are to blame. The European Central Bank last week announced a hike in interest rates for the first time in 11 years, but Eurostat also found that GDP across the Eurozone is on the rise, with a 0.1% increase seen across the bloc in the second quarter of the year. The European Commissioner for the Economy says that while the Union has outperformed expectations, the near-term outlook is still uncertain. For more on this, I spoke to economy expert Jacob Kierkegaard, a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and he told me that current statistics are easing recession fears.
Basically, we have a situation of so far so good. We have much stronger growth in the second quarter of the year, particularly in Southern Europe, Spain, Italy, major upside surprises with a growth over 1%. But we still, of course, have a very significant inflation problem across the euro area, which the ECB is only at the beginning of addressing with a rate hike last week. But at the same time, we have a major source of uncertainty associated with the potential of a full cutoff of gas from Russia, of course. So in some way, we have to wait and see. If that doesn't materialize, if in many ways the European economy therefore doesn't suffer acute energy shortages, we may well still avoid a recession. I don't think we will avoid a major slowdown, but we may very well, on the back of these numbers, avoid a recession.
So in light of the inflation numbers in particular, should we be anticipating that the European Central Bank actually makes moves, particularly in September once again? And do you think that'll be enough, let's say, for example, if we do see Russia turn off the gas taps?
Well, I think with the inflation numbers that we saw, there is very little doubt that the ECB will hike rates probably by another 50 basis points in September. The only question really is, what do they do after that? Because that is the point in time in which we'll have a much better idea about the gas supply situation for the European economy coming into the winter, and therefore also on whether or not we may or may not need to ration gas for industry, etc., in some countries. So, excuse me, in that sense, the short-term interest rate outlook is very clear, but we are still in a situation where ultimately what will tame inflation potentially is the expected growth slowdown in the euro area in the second half of 2022.
Briefly, Jacob, if you don't mind, are there any countries which are looking a little bit more concerning than others right now?
Well, I don't think there's any doubt that the flat growth in Germany already in the second quarter is a cause of concern, because we know that Germany is one of the countries that have to reduce domestic demand for gas the most. It is one of the countries that is most exposed to potential rationing of gas for heavy industrial use. And therefore, I think in that sense, Germany, of all the the euro area members, are probably the one looking most likely to experience a contraction in the economy in the second half.
Well, as Europe faces a growing natural gas crisis, it is urgently looking for ways to save on energy in case Russia does turn off the taps. And EU energy ministers this week agreed to voluntarily cut gas usage across the bloc by 15% in the run-up to winter. Now, member states are trying to find ways to meet that goal. In Spain, Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez has called on public officials to stop wearing ties in a bid to stay cool instead of relying on air conditioning. Elsewhere in the German city of Hanover, they will cut off hot water in gyms, swimming pools and public buildings, as well as introducing a ban on mobile air conditioning units and radiators. Well, German authorities also say that they will impose a gas tax to cover the cost of replacing Russian supplies. Here's our reporter Kristina Jovanovski in Berlin.
This levy will be applied to gas consumers across the country, including to households. We're expecting hundreds of euros extra a year that households will be having to pay for this gas levy. The idea is that consumers and individuals and companies would be sharing in the cost of decreasing Germany's reliance on Russian gas. It was last year 55% of gas imports is now down to about 1/3 of gas imports for Germany. Last week, a company had to get a bailout from the German government. So there is major concerns about the economy and for companies. For a household of 4 people, we're told that their price would be about 500 euros extra a year, but it could even go up to 1,000 euros. This levy is expected to be applied in August and last at least until September next year. And we are expecting to get more details about this draft law in August, but we're already feeling some of that limitation. Nord Stream 1, the gas pipeline from Russia, had decreased its capacity to 20% already. So we know that there's going to be major issues in the winter.
Plenty more coming up after a short break. Don't go anywhere.